Let's think a little bit more about the household codes in the New Testament. In the ancient context, we're discussing a household code as a moralistic and hierarchically organized description of how husbands, wives, children, and slaves ought to relate to one another in something like a discrete family unit. There are three such household codes in the New Testament, one in Ephesians chapter 5 and 6, one in Colossians chapter 3 and 4, and one in 1 Peter chapters 2 and 3. Household codes are a common feature of moralizing Greco-Roman literature, and we have several extra-biblical examples going all the way back to Aristotle at least. So their appearance in the New Testament appears to be a Christian appropriation, or as this comment says, a Christian cultural interpretation of a commonly occurring idealized standard of household relations in the wider Greco-Roman world. I think one of the most relevant questions we can ask in our study of the New Testament is, why did these early Christian communities find it desirable or useful to adapt this Greco-Roman moral model for thinking about their own Christian households? And while a variety of different answers can be given to this question, I think one of the best answers in terms of explanatory power and in terms of relatability to present circumstance is to think of the New Testament's appropriation of these household codes as a form of respectability politics. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any biblical scholarship that specifically looks at the household codes in the New Testament in terms of respectability politics, but I am aware of this article right here by womanist biblical scholar Mitzi Smith called Paul, Timothy, and the Respectability Politics of Race that uses the lens of respectability politics to analyze some passages in the book of Acts. I think Smith's description of respectability politics in this context is very helpful for thinking about what's happening with these early Christian household codes. She says here, respectability politics is the notion that if a member of a subordinated, marginalized, or oppressed group exhibits acceptable and submissive behaviors, is socially compliant in her appearance and ways of being, achieves some measure of success regardless of any systemic obstacles, and according to the standards of the dominant culture, she will be accepted by the dominant group. She will be treated justly and equally and will earn access to the same privileges and protected rights enjoyed by the dominant group. As early Christian communities are struggling for social acceptance and to avoid persecution, it would make sense for them to adopt, in at least outward appearance, a moral standard of behavior that the dominant Greco-Roman culture would associate with proper households. Looked at in this way, the New Testament household codes are a cultural concession and a survival strategy adopted to mitigate the worst effects of early Christian marginalization. Also looked at this way, these household codes no longer have any normative moral force, because of course for Christians, at least in the contemporary Western developed world, we are no longer marginalized, and so there's no reason to employ these as a survival strategy against that marginalization. The original burden of that cultural concession has been lifted from us. We no longer need to conceive of our households in the same way that first century Greco-Roman people did. Now we can conceive of our households in much more authentically Christian ways, which I think will have more radical consequences.